All right, everybody. Well, welcome to small group. I hope you guys had a good time of mingling and snacks. Just a couple things I want to talk about before we dive into this week's teaching. First of all, if you're new here, I just wanted to say what we're all about. And we are essentially all about following Jesus together. That whether it's here in small groups or at our worship nights or on the retreat we just had, that is our goal as a youth group. That we want to, no matter what stage of faith you're at, whether you have no faith, whether you are just beginning to believe, or whether you've been believing in Jesus for a long time, we want to look at what it looks like to actually follow Jesus together. And we do that in three different ways. We do it by creating a space where you can experience God and who He is, creating a space where you feel like you can belong, where you're known, and getting to know other people, and then also a place where you can encounter rest and experience kind of that peace that God brings. And so some of the ways we do that are through things like this. It's through worship nights, but we have a bunch of other things, and so we're just pumped that you're here. And so I have a few announcements before we dive into things. And so first up is our 6-7 masterclass. So if you are in grade 7, on Sundays at the 9 o'clock service, we have the Bible Masterclass happening. It's kind of a 2-year program where you sing a song during church at worship, and then you're kind of dismissed and you go downstairs into what used to be Area 45. And we right now are going through the entire Bible. And so up until this point, we've been talking about what is the Bible and how do you read it? And then this week, we're going to be diving into creation. And so that's really sweet. And so if you are in grade 7, be sure to join in on that. It's a great time. And then in addition to that, we also have something coming up, and that is our SBC Youth Late Nighter. Now, this is happening on Friday, November 17th. It's on a Friday, so that way we can stay up late and you can sleep in. And so what's going to be happening is this is just going to be an evening of a ton of games and fun. And so throughout it, you're going to be with your small group, and you're going to go to kind of like a bunch of different stations, and we'll have all kinds of different things. And we're going to stay up until around 12 o'clock. And so that'll be from 7 to 12, and it'll be a time of just hanging out, having fun, and staying up late. And so if you're interested in that, be sure to show up on Friday. And then of course that week we won't have normal youth because this will be our youth for that week. And so that's coming up Friday, November 17th. And so with that, why don't you introduce yourselves as your small group? Again, we just do this because if we create a rhythm where you always are anticipating new people showing up, it means that it's not weird when they actually do show up and you've got to do something different. And so, this is also helpful just to learn more about each other. So go around the room, say your name, say your high of the week, what was something that was really great, and your low of the week, something that was lame. Go. So this past week, we had our high school retreat, and it was great. We essentially went to Maple Springs Bible Camp, and we hung out, and we sang some worship songs together. We read the Bible. We played some games. It was a great time. And one of the things that kind of stood out to me that actually happened during the conversational time was Danielle asked a question that actually required a lot of thought, as Danielle sometimes does if you know who she is. And it was a question that she was actually going around asking a bunch of different people. And her question was essentially this. It was, what is the best advice that you've ever received? And so she was asking different leaders and students that, and it really brought up interesting conversation. And I remember when she asked me about it, that it took like some thought, where like initially nothing jumps out. The first thing I said was like, follow Jesus, which to me is the best advice I've ever received. But for like a pastor, that feels like a cop-out answer, but that is the genuine answer. But I thought, okay, like what's some actual like piece of advice other than that? That was the best advice I'd ever received. And I kind of tried to think through a bunch of things, and pretty much the only thing that really came to mind was something that I was told in high school. And I was told this rule as like a way to live, and it actually proved to be really reliable. And so the advice was this. It was that nothing good happens after 2 a.m. And as I grew up in high school and college until now, I have found that piece of advice incredibly helpful and true. That once I heard it, I had began realizing that almost all of the issues in my friends' lives or giant mistakes they made, it would always happen sometime around the 2 a.m. mark. And if you just decide like, hey, I'm going to go to bed. Nothing good happens after 2 a.m. There's no point being out. There's no point going to this. There's no point texting this person because nothing positive can possibly happen at 2 a.m. in the morning. That is actually correct advice. And if you follow that, it will actually save yourself a ton of harm and mistake and regrets. And so that was kind of my advice and the thing that stood out and the thing that was really true. But I want you guys to discuss this yourselves. And so in your small groups, I want you to answer this question: what is the best advice you have ever received? So we are in this series called Shalom. Shalom is a Hebrew word that means peace, and we're talking about the peace that only Jesus can bring and the kind of rest that he can bring to us specifically. And so we are kind of in the last week of this series. And up until this point, Jesus has been giving a bunch of different advice that he often is being like, hey, like, I know that the world says that this is going to give you rest, but it's not. And I know that you actually are facing a ton of anxiety. I'm telling you, like, here's the answer and the solution to what you're facing. And so Jesus has been giving us all of this different advice of how we can build our lives and structure them to be a people who actually experience the peace and joy and rest that God actually has in store for us. And essentially, as we conclude, I wanted to highlight this message from Jesus. And so we're going to read a section of scripture that's from this thing called the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is essentially Jesus's biggest and longest and like most in-depth teaching of what it looks like to be a follower of him. And he kind of teaches all of these different things and he gives all of this different advice. But at the end of it, he gives kind of his best advice, where if someone were to ask like, hey, Jesus, like, what's the best advice I could ever receive? This is going to be kind of Jesus's advice. And if I could sum it up into like one main idea for you, it would be this. It's that an unshakable life is built on an unshakable foundation. And so with that, let's dive into Jesus's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. And so again, he's taught for a bunch of different chapters and a bunch of different things that you can go back and read. And kind of at the end of this sermon, this is how he concludes it. He says this: therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house. Yet it didn't collapse because its foundation was on the rock. So Jesus has done all of this teaching and he's kind of taught what it looks like to follow him. And so he concludes this sermon by saying like, hey, if you're someone who's wise, if you're someone who is smart and intelligent, you're actually going to build your life on my teaching. That actually what I've told you up to this point, you're going to build your entire life on it, because what I've shown you is actually a solid foundation. It's actually something you can build your life on. It's not a shakable foundation that you can't trust. That this is actually going to lead to real life. That I'm actually the God who made you and created you and know who you were designed to be and how you were wired and designed and what it actually looks like to be truly human. And so if you actually follow me and you follow my advice, you're actually going to experience rest and peace and what it means to be truly human. And Jesus's life is that foundation, and his teaching is that foundation that we can build our lives on, that it's something that's actually trustworthy, and that it's actually something that requires a lot of work, but will lead to actual life. It's kind of like this. So I am not a construction person. If you hang around me long enough, I am definitely someone who's meant to work in an office with air conditioning and not do that. But there was a season of my life where for a summer job, I worked construction, and specifically I worked in bricklaying. And bricklaying is incredibly hard work that while it does bring a reward, right? At the end of the day, when you've made this like nice path, you're like, look at all this work I've done. But it is incredibly difficult, where you all day, every day in the summer, in the crazy heat, are just carrying like loads of bricks with your hands back and forth. You're laying them, you're cutting them. It's a brutal job, but it was a fun experience. And what I learned in bricklaying is that you would imagine that you kind of just like make a path, you know, like for someone who doesn't work construction, I was like, oh yeah, like you'll tear up the ground a bit and then you'll just start laying bricks. But that's not what you do. That actually the foundation that you put those bricks on is the most important part of bricklaying. That if your foundation is wrong, it doesn't matter how beautiful your path looks in the moment, that in 10 years, this thing is going to fall apart. That the foundation is the most important thing you can do as a bricklayer. And so what we would do, and this would take a ton of time, is we would begin by shoveling. So we would see the path, we would see what we wanted to do, and we would spend a ton of work with a ton of guys shoveling it out. And we would go super deep, and you would shovel more than you thought was necessary, and it was incredible back-breaking work. And so for like 2 or 3 days, you would just shovel out a path. And then once you're done shoveling and removing all of that junk, then you've got to start to lay a foundation. And so you would pour this sand mixed with gravel, all kind of around, and you would spread it out so that it's even, so that the path can be flat, and it gives it that solid foundation. But then on top of that, once you've done that, you have to take this thing called a tamper, and it's pretty much just like big machine that smacks the ground really hard to like make the foundation compact. And so you would go around, and this was the most fun part of building the foundation, was like using the tamper. And you'd go around and you would start to tamp the ground, and you would make sure that it was level, and you would make sure that it was all smooth and it was tamped down and it was sweet and legit. And then you also would use water just to kind of help with that process. And again, all throughout this, you are literally taking a level, so like a thing that tells you if something is actually straight and solid, and you would be going over each part of the path and painstakingly making sure every section was perfectly level. Because if it wasn't, if this foundation wasn't perfect, if it wasn't trustworthy, in 5-10 years, the path that we're building for whoever paid us to come and build it was going to be utter garbage. And you see this stuff all the time in bricklaying, that once you do this and you know how to do it rightly, when you're walking down a path that hasn't actually had a solid foundation, you notice it, where either grass is coming out, and that shouldn't be happening, because they should have built a foundation that wouldn't have had grass like popping out in between the brick. And you also would have had, you see where it starts to get unlevel and where things start to move and break apart. And that's because they didn't do the foundation properly. And so also on top of that, so once you finish that foundation, then you can start laying your bricks. And so you lay them, you cut them, you make the path and the design that the person wants. And then after you're done laying the bricks, you take more sand and gravel, you spread it all across the brick, you sweep it, and then you again just like lay it all flat, and you do what needs to be done to make sure that that thing is settled, and then you finally have your path. But what I want you to notice is the amount of work that just goes into laying that solid foundation. That it is incredibly painful and difficult to do so. That it makes you insanely tired, and it feels like a lot of work, and sometimes it feels really hard, and you're just like, I don't want to do this. Can we just like snap our fingers and get to the end where we have the beautiful brick walkway or whatever we're building? And the thing is that you can't. And that to have a solid foundation, it does take work, because what you have to do is you have to go in and pull out the stuff that doesn't belong, that you can't just build off of what you already have. You need to actually excavate and get rid of some of that junk so that you can begin laying the solid foundation. And for us in Jesus, sometimes we can read his words and hear what he has to say. And when he's like, dude, this is how you should build your life, it can feel like a lot of work, and it can feel overwhelming. And at times it can feel really painful and difficult, because what Jesus is trying to do is, like any good bricklayer, is he's trying to come into our lives and actually rip out all the junk, that he's trying to shovel out all the dirt, and he's going to start laying sand, and he's going to start tamping it and watering it down so that he can build your life on a solid foundation. And what we're often tempted to do is to not do that. That we just want to kind of lay the bricks on top of what we already have and hope that it works out for the best. But what Jesus knows is that in like 10, 15 years, that if that's how you build your life, if you want to build it on what you already have instead of excavating your life and letting Jesus replace it with a real solid foundation, that if you just want to lay it on that foundation, it's going to fall apart. That in 10, 15 years, your life isn't going to end up where you're wanting. And that beautiful path you thought you were building is actually going to be a mess. That actually the hard work of letting Jesus enter into your life and dig out all of those different things that he challenges you with, that's actually how the path gets built. That actually in doing that difficult process, that you're actually going to find that you have a solid foundation, that you've actually built your life on Jesus's teaching, and it's going to last. That in 10, 15 years, the path is going to look just as beautiful as it was in day one, because you did the hard work with Jesus of excavating the foundation of your heart, laying down the gravel and the sand, tamping it down, laying the brick, laying more gravel and sand on it, sweeping it, washing it, and you're going to have that solid, awesome path. And so in your small groups, I want you to discuss this. Why do you think Jesus says that we should build our life on his words and not something else? How would your life look different if you chose to build it on Jesus instead of other things? But with that, Jesus isn't quite done his sermon yet, and so he concludes by saying this. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house, and it collapsed. And it collapsed with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, because he was teaching them like one who actually had authority and not like their scribes. And so Jesus here kind of is saying what I just said in the last section, that you need to actually let Jesus come in and build your life on that solid foundation. And how you do that is by actually taking his teaching seriously, by actually following his ways, by actually submitting yourself to the things that he has called you to. And you'll find that that will excavate out the idols, the sin, the anxiety, all the different things that are kind of entangling your life into becoming something that will look monstrous in 10 to 15 years, that he will excavate all of that out of your heart. And instead your life is going to be built on that solid foundation of Jesus' teaching. But the opposite is also true, that if you want to just lay your bricks on top of the grass or on top of whatever you have and hope that it just works out fine, you can do that. But just like how the bricks that I would lay if I were to do that in 10 to 15 years would look like an absolute mess, even though in the moment, right now, it might look fine, later on, it's going to look horrible. In the same way, the same is true about your life. That right now, it might look fine, but in 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, your life is going to be a mess. That when the storms of life come, your house is not going to stand. That if you want to build it on a foundation that isn't actually sustainable, that your house is going to explode. It's going to crash. If a storm comes, it's not going to be able to face it. And some of you feel that, where the things you've built your life on, you're now seeing that it's not working. And that creates all kinds of anxiety and stress, because you're like, this is what I built my life on. What am I supposed to do now? I feel like my world is collapsing. And that's what Jesus is saying, that if you want to do that, if you want to build your life just on the stuff you've already got and you don't want to surrender to him, he's just warning you that that's not going to work out well for you, that your life is going to crash. And see, everybody's building their life on something, and people don't think they are, but they are. Every single person in the world worships something, that they are building their life on something. You're like, what? I don't worship anything. I'm an atheist or whatever. Everybody worships. Whether you worship Jesus, or you worship Allah, or you worship money, or you worship sex, or you worship power, or you worship grades, or you worship people's opinion, that you actually worship. That some of you, it's actually people's opinion, that how people see you and perceive you is actually your God, and that you actually make sacrifices and worship it, not by bowing down to it, but by like sacrificing large parts of your life so that others will think highly of you. Or for some of you, it's money, where you sacrifice time and like energy into pursuing money, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's become an idol. It's become a God for you, and that thing is going to eat you alive. Same thing with sex, or maybe the way you look. That if you worship your body image and looking a certain way, you will never be enough. That you will never be beautiful enough. You will never be fit enough. You will never look the way you want to look. It's why celebrities who worship this whole idea of beauty constantly are getting surgeries to change the way they look, because it's never enough. And eventually you're just going to get old anyways, and there's nothing you can do. And the thing is that all these different gods that we pursue will consume us, that they will devour us, and all of us are worshiping something. We're all building our life on something, and Jesus is saying that the only God that will actually show you real life is him. That all of these other gods are false gods, that they're idols, that they can't actually be the thing that you're looking for, that you have this hole in your life that you're trying to fill with all of these other things, but it can't. That the only thing that can actually fill that piece that you feel like you're missing is Jesus. And that if you actually choose to surrender to him and to build your life on him instead of all these other things, that you're actually going to experience rest, that you're actually going to experience peace, that you're actually going to experience true and real joy. And at first it's going to be hard, because to lay that foundation initially is really difficult and back-breaking work. That to like excavate all of the idols and the gods that you have set up in your heart and replace it with Jesus is hard, but it's so worth it, because in 10 to 15 years, you're going to end up in a place that you never even dreamed that you would be, that you will look almost nightmarish to yourself now. But if you choose to build on Jesus, you're going to have a path and a foundation of your life that is solid, that you can trust, that the path that you're building now will be just as beautiful in 15, 10 years. And you'll look back and be like, oh, it's so incredible to see how this has lasted, versus being someone who builds it on something else that isn't Jesus and it looks disastrous. And so with that, I want you guys to discuss this in your groups. What do you see people building their lives on today? Do you think the things people are choosing to build their lives on are actually leading to life? Why or why not? An unshakable life is built on an unshakable foundation. Just like how Daniil came to me and asked me what the best life advice I ever received was, my real answer is to follow Jesus. That this is kind of Jesus's life advice. If someone were like, hey, Jesus, what's the best thing I can do? He would say, follow me. That's the best thing you can do. Build your life on me, and that's actually going to lead to the life that you're longing for. And you've got to build it on that solid rock, that you can't build it on all these different things our culture and the people around you want you to build it on, that you can't build on the things you're trying to currently build it on, that you need to let Jesus enter into your life. You need to let his teaching challenge you and to excavate the ground and to shovel out all that dirt so that he can begin laying a foundation. And once you guys together lay that foundation and you do all the hard work of doing it, then you can start to build your life on it. And you'll have a foundation that you can trust that in 10, 15, 25, 50 years, it's going to look just as amazing now, and then that path is going to last. But you can choose to be like most of the world, where most of us are worshiping something that isn't Jesus, because everybody worships and everybody's building their life on something, whether it's money, power, sex, fame, fortune, whatever, that everybody else is building their life on something. But the problem is they're not building it on a good foundation, and what they're going to find is that in 10, 15, 25 years, it's not going to work. That their idols and their gods are actually going to consume them, and it's only in actually surrendering to Jesus's way that they will experience true life. Because an unshakable life is built on an unshakable foundation. So with that, why don't you guys take some time to pray for one another, and you can hang out if you're done a little bit early, or you can go home if you're done a bit late, and we will see you guys at our worship gathering all together at the church next week. So we will see you then.